last time, I guess that some of you listened to the webinar that Ibrat organized a couple of months ago, where I talked about this book, Return to Meaning, about how to develop a social science with something to say. And one overall answer to increase the chances of having something important and relevant and interesting to say to a qualified audience is then to work with reflexivity. And I will give 3 lectures or webinars here this and forthcoming weeks. Let's see here. And the overall idea is then to support more reflexive and creative methodology. For me, reflexivity is very much something that should pay off in terms of not just people being able then to reason in smart ways, but also able then to come up with something in terms of concepts, ideas, perspectives, interpretations, results that are a bit unexpected. So I will talk based on the book Reflexive Methodology, which is a very kind of Bible-like book in terms of it's kind of thick and includes everything you need to know almost in order to either do a successful PhD or be a successful researcher or get gray hairs too early in your career. No guarantees. And then next time I will talk about how to construct research questions and get ideas. And then third talk will be on how to work with mysteries in research. Look for the mystery, the unexpected, the surprising, the challenge. And if you don't see it immediately, you need to cultivate your capacity to see and work with mysteries. We are too much into control and then using our frames, and then we domesticate phenomena. We are not sufficiently open in order to see interesting aspects. I mean, social life, organizational life, management phenomena, they are quite fascinating, but we tend sometimes just to kind of see them like this. And this is the opposite of reflexive research. So here are the 3 books that I shamelessly then try to promote, and they are probably in your library, so you can borrow them there. So I will not be accused of having a commercial interest, but of course, as a researcher, you're very interested in people reading the stuff. And particularly reflexive methodology has been quite influential and cited quite a lot. So I think it's a good read if you're interested in reflexivity and want to use it in order to get somewhere in your studies and not just being kind of good at talking about ontology and epistemology and various isms in research. So what I talked about in the other lecture was very much that we are in a rather bad situation in management and business studies, and that's one reason why this responsible research in business and management network was founded, that we have enormous expansion of research. So more and more researchers doing more and more research projects, publishing more and more, in particular trying to publish more and more. Not so much of real interest comes out of all this. We have massification of higher education, and then we also have massification of research. And does this lead to a lot of good stuff appearing? Nope, not necessarily. And it appears that we are doing research not when you start. When you start, you often have some ambitious, but then you are kind of socialized into a logic, which means that it's very much a matter of being employ, promote, and metrics bill. So you are employable, promotable, and you are metricsable. So enough publications rather than having anything more to say is very important. And we easily end up after some time in academia, perhaps particularly in countries like UK, Australia, United States, where there is really a lot of competition about students, competition about rankings and so on, that people end up as journal producing technicians. not scholars, but very much into journal publication optimization. And that's kind of fine partly, but it easily leads to studies that are formulaic, they're incremental, they're very much oriented to the academic tribe that you are belonging to. Because the logic in journal publication is that you should be assessed by people that are experts in your sub area. And these tend to be relatively good at expertise, but not necessarily having a broader picture. So they expect then you to do something that is in line with the norms and conventions and the kind of local truths in a particular field. And this means that academia, contemporary academia, is very much a hothouse of functional stupidity. People that are quite narrow-minded and very rational and smart and so on, but within narrow specialized frameworks. And this is a success formula, and that's cultivated and reinforced, rewarded, but it doesn't mean that research becomes particularly interesting. Because interesting stuff often means that you are not into that kind of narrow-minded logic. So what can we do here? I mean, I worked for a long time with various ways of making research a bit more interesting, challenging, provocative, creative. And this, of course, easier said than done, but methodology can support this. Methodology is not only about being as rational as possible, reliable, rational, validity, reliability, blah, 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 but it can also be used in order to generate empirically kind of sound and supported, but still novel and interesting ideas. So when I talk about this, then I often have general stuff about reflexivity, and then two applications of the general idea. And one is about challenging assumptions, and the second is the search for mysteries. So, but today I will talk about reflexivity more generally. And often then people think that good studies, good research is very much to design a study, read the literature, design a study, do a lot of data management, and then write up, analyze the stuff, and then write up the results. So it's a relatively straightforward kind of route with a lot of techniques and procedures and so on. Well, if it was that simple, and normally you miss so much if you just go for this quite square-headed way of doing research. So reflexivity means that you try to take on board a lot of the complications of all this. And when I and Kai Sköldberg, author of this book, Reflexive Methodology, this is the third edition actually, we thought about this. We thought that reflexivity for us is very much a matter of how that you appreciate, you think deeply about how various kinds of linguistic language, how it operates, how you use it, social, like cultural phenomena, social institutions, and a lot of other things that all the time is interference and directing us in research, how political aspects like values and ideologies and interests and so on, as well as the theoretical elements. We use particular conceptions of power or innovation or gender, whatever. These are all then crucial part of your knowledge development process. And through then the intertwinement of this in almost every move that you are making, when you think about issues, structure the world, you read literature, you consider questions to ask people or things to observe if you do observations, or you try to interpret data. All these are involved in this. So it strongly influences how empirical material is being constructed, not discovered, but constructed, how it's being interpreted, and how you write it. So this is one view on reflexivity. And reflexivity is used in an endless number of different ways. That's always the case in qualitative research, that you don't have a single dominant definition. But this is how we see it. And compared to a lot of other people, it's not so much about me, how I'm involved, what I'm doing, how I saw things and so on. It's very much about the intellectual operations and the social context and how that kind of influence you in your work. A more simple definition is for us also that reflexivity, it's interpretation of interpretation. So in qualitative research, we always interpret phenomena, literature, data, what people mean, and so on. We interpret all the time, more or less, in more or less refined ways. But then reflexivity means that you take one step back, so you interpret your own interpretations. How come that I see it in this way? Or that we, people in my research group or research community, we tend to talk so bloody much about leadership or innovation or entrepreneurship or resistance or knowledge or competence or whatever we are doing. So you try to interpret your own interpretations. You put your own thinking into a particular perspective. And then you have another intellectual twist and another possibility to liberate yourself from all the kind of conventions and taking for granted notions that otherwise are in operation. So, and a lot of ideas around social science emphasize the method. The scientific method. And here you have buzzwords or values like rationality, procedure, techniques, objectivity, transparency, replicability, theory, data, separation, etc. And these are valuable aspects around research, and we can never disregard them. But in some cases, this is overemphasized. So you have, like in Strauss, grounded theory, Anselm Strauss and his co-author, they emphasize that good research, it means that the matching of theory against data must be rigorously carried out. So you must be very strict. Here you have theory, and here you have data, and then if data says that theory is wrong, then theory should be revised so it fits into data. Of course, and here the delivery of results, you do good research through data management. You collect, you refine, you process, analyze, present data. So as a researcher, you are very much a data manager, a technician. Reliable, hardworking, systematic, you account for what you're doing, you follow method rules. If you are into reflexivity, you will say that this is important, but it's impossible. And it's also not something that we should put all our energies into. So I could say that the matching of theory against data must be rigorously carried out, could be contrasted with a counter view. And reflexivity is very much that you work with a dominant view and then you come up with a counter view. And the counter view could be that the matching of theory against data can't be carried out. It's impossible because data tend always to be theory impregnated. Theory impregnated. So in order to see something, to produce data, to make an observation, to get people to respond to your interview questions, then you need to have a theory. So you need to have a theory of leadership and gender and decisions and creativity or whatever in order to make sense of anything as data. So theory tends to govern data. apart from trivial things, we can count the number of people being present in a room. You don't have to have a theory of that. But if you move into management and business issues, then almost anything that you're interested in studying, it calls for a theory. Are you satisfied with a lecture? I mean, you need to have an idea what is satisfaction. For example, I mean, you can't just rely on people saying something. Well, I'm happy about that. That's good. Or whatever. You need to have an idea of what is this. And the person that is responding to your interview need to have an idea what is the meaning with satisfaction. That you are not unhappy, that you are full of joy, or this is a kind of consistent response. So it's just a conventional way of expressing yourself. Yeah, I'm happy, I'm satisfied, or whatever. So we need to have a theory in order to work with data. And for reflexivity, it's very much then a matter of emphasizing other virtues, other key elements in good research. It's a matter of discipline and imagination, where you combine the two ideals of trying to be imaginative, think about options, not just the right way. Data means this. It may mean a lot of different things. So you consider then different possible meanings and use your fantasy in order to see options. And of course, you use disciplines. You are not just like throwing up any kind of idea, but you also are self-critical and see what's problematic, what's not so novel or not so interesting in this. But discipline imagination is a very good part of reflexivity. You try to very carefully consider how paradigms, pre-understandings, the stuff that you bring with you into a study, how language use is operating. I mean, is it more mirror of reality? Or is language something that is performative? That language does something, creates effects. So ask people, tell me about your leadership. And then you assume that this is just a trigger of data production. Or if leadership is a performative term, where people feel like some expectations and some hope and some want or whatever to live up to norms, and they feel kind of proud, I'm into leadership and so on, then it works in a very different way. So language needs to be carefully considered in terms of how does it operate. Is it more mirroring reality? Is it performative? And of course, there's a lot of variation in different situations for different people. Theory data fusion, not separating data management. Time be aware that how theory drive then the data that you are producing, and if you switch theory, then there's another production process or construction process going on. Reflexivity is also very much about how conventions, our peculiar habits for doing things in academia, how they work. So, and then if conventional ideas, including in most part of qualitative research, and increasingly so because of formulaic studies being more and more popular, then the emphasis is very much on the delivery of results. But in reflexivity, you don't necessarily trust the results in that way, but the key point is very much the crafting of an insightful text. A text that makes the researcher, author, but also the reader to think about the issues in a more clever way. For considering different options and alternative ways, perhaps, of making sense of phenomena. So, reflexivity can very much be operationalized as the challenging of a preferred vocabulary or theoretical perspective. So you have here is one, and then you have an alternative. Always prepared to consider one or several alternatives to this. So you can use different points of departure. You study managers, for example. That's fine, you study managers here. But then if you study managers as junior to senior people, or you study managers as senior to low-level people, which is often the case then, that we study them. But that's only one aspect. And then you study them as perhaps professionals, as colleagues, as corporate citizens, as corporate slaves, or whatever. Then you have access to some different perspectives on, in this case, managers. And then if you shouldn't overdo this, but if you can change points of departure or use different languages, different perspectives, then you open up then for reflexivity. And then after some time, you probably need to, you open up and then you close, or at least you close some or all the opportunities. But the idea is that you through this closure or selection of possible options, that you have some ideas on your mind, and then you see in your research process which of this does work, which is promising, which makes me even more creative and have empirical support and so on. But in order to do all this, we can't just go out there and look at phenomena or look at theories about phenomena. We need also to look at ourselves and our own inclinations to see things in a particular way. And see that is sometimes a bit strange, actually. I was interested in leadership or followership or professionals or services or whatever. So, and here one key element is then to ask what tends to produce a certain truth. And normally we would believe that phenomena, they are out there, we do a study, and then we come up with findings based on the nature of the phenomena that we are studying. So that's one option. Reality out there is kind of the key driver behind what we are doing and what we are producing. But often that what we produce knowledge about is very much an outcome of our own conventions, our paradigms, theories, our ideas, expectations, pressure to address entrepreneurship or mergers, companies, they merge, for example, or identities, or whatever you are interested in. It's very much like projections of the researcher, the individual researcher, and even more of the research community, that we agree, well, there are such things as identity, and now we go out and then we find identity every bloody time we're out there and observing people or interviewing them or whatever, and then there is an addition to identity. I mean, I've done this myself, between you and me, and a lot of people do that, can find it important then to think, are we studying phenomena out there? Do we say something insightful about reality? Or is it very much that we project our own then inclinations? And here we can consider Foucault, who says that most people are worried about knowledge not revealing the truth. We may be so worried in our research that we are not getting at the truth. We are missing it, or we are distorting the truth. That is kind of the major worry of most people. So we are so desperately eager to get it all right. Large sample, data management, codification, relationship to other literatures, and blah, 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 blah. But for Foucault, the problem with knowledge is not that it may distort the truth. The problem with knowledge is that it creates the truth. The problem with knowledge is that it creates the truth. So, and then we have a lot of, leadership, because there's a lot of knowledge about leadership, and then managers, the poor bloody managers, they can't just be administrators or supervisors or nagging and hagging with people and make sure that operations are there. They need to do leadership. You need to have a vision. You need to be charismatic, transformational, authentic, and a lot of other stuff that is being kind of produced as knowledge outcomes coming from social research, from HR, from consultants and the large industry. And then you create a particular type of truth in organizations. Not there before then, all the leadership stuff. The same with entrepreneurship, the same with strategic management. Once upon a time, that was not necessarily a key thing, but now we have enormous amount of strategic management. And then the poor executives, they're not happy with running operations. They need to do a lot of stuff in terms of working with strategies, visions, and a lot of facts. So, and of course, contemporary organizations, as you all know, they are full of management knowledge, unfortunately. If we think about universities that are overmanaged, over-bureaucratized, and I mean, some of you come from UK, where I think that the average UK universities, they have more people in admin, service, support, management than people doing research and teaching. Because we have this enormous amount of management knowledge, customer relations and visions and HR and quality procedures and strategies and you name it. So the point here is we need to be, but we need to be much more careful about what we are doing in terms of thinking. Where our ideas, habits, perspectives, models, knowledge, enterprises coming from. And a lot of this is not as innocent as it appears. Okay. You see my point, hopefully. And of course, this means that we can open up for much more creative and interesting ideas than we are just into this cement, concrete of believing that the world is out there, kind of fixed, and now I need to go out there and study quality stuff or knowledge management or whatever. So the problem with knowledge is that it creates it, and we need to be much more careful in how we create knowledge. So before then, we decided there are two kinds of people, men and women, and they are now to be measured or interviewed in terms of their authentic experience and so on. We should perhaps, well, perhaps not. And here we can consider Kent Gergen's statement about gender. What was once upon a time seen as a robust and unquestionable fact that there are two sexes is now slowly but safely on its way to mythology. Once upon a time seen as a crystal clear fact, two sexes, is now an idea slowly but surely on its way to mythology. Apart, of course, from people into equal opportunity initiatives and so on. They're always out there and counting bodies, one or the other. And you can do that. There may be good reasons for doing this. But the point here is that we need to be much more careful about our basic moves when we do research. And often if we take too much for granted, then there's an enormous amount of intellectual opportunities, creative moments that we tend to kind of lose because we rush to the phenomena and we are too much influenced by conventions. So there are two major problems in research as I see it. One is that people do a lot of stupid things. The average paper that I read when I'm a reviewer, which I spend a lot of time doing, unfortunately, or the research project that I'm kind of assessing, I do that quite a lot as well, they are full of things that are being taken for granted and naively assumed. So people do a lot of stupid, and that's because we follow conventions and we look at what others done before us, and then we reproduce these habits and so on. And we tend to be a bit narrow in our mindsets. So that's one problem, that people do a lot of stupid things in research. We all do, me also, but that's something that we should be aware of. Even if you do everything correctly, then we do stupid things. And that's one problem. The other problem is that we have very seldom anything interesting to say, something that is novel, that is something that is not being kind of said by too many people too many times before, more or less, because there's always a footnote adding element, but it's often very of marginal interest and relevance. And it's partly because we tend to follow conventions and recipes. And there are some formulas that people tend to preach all the time, that it's very then tempting to say, this is good advice, this is what I should do. I do as others, and I do two things in my research. I position myself clearly within a particular body of literature or knowledge, within a particular academic sub-tribe, or people that share perverse interest in knowledge management in pharmaceutical companies in the northern part of Russia. So you position yourself there, and then you add to what other people that are clearly positioned in this small field that have said and meant before. So you add to theory. And this is kind of logical and fine, and it's sometimes to be recommended, but it doesn't make it particularly interesting, because it's very much the conventions being repeated. And then people tend to follow method conventions also, including spending a lot of time in codification. You probably have learned that you should codify your empirical material, and that may be okay. Perhaps it may not be. Here, one can make a small joke about codification, which means that you analyze stuff and you pull it into small boxes and pieces, and then you decontextualize it. And you can say about this that it's easier to turn an aquarium into a fish soup than a fish soup into an aquarium. Easier to turn a fish soup into aquarium than an aquarium. Sorry. Easier to turn into a fish soup than a fish into an aquarium. And the idea, of course, that if you slice things up too much, then you kind of manageable, but you lose a sense of context, how it hangs together, interesting links and patterns and so on, that is not being, that's kind of distorted by this kind of chopping up of stuff. I mean, if you like to do codification, that's fine. I've never done that myself. I like to put stuff into broader boxes, and then I go back and forth between material. I look at context. I interpret parts in the light of the whole, like in hermeneutics, and then it's a very different type of understanding. And I do think that it gives you a bit more good ideas occasionally, at least. So, yes, how we are doing with time? Well, we have a bit more time, I think. The truth is not necessarily the eye of the beholder, but it tends always partly to be in the eye of the beholder. a lot of our truths, they are coming from our own conventions, paradigms, ideologies, convictions, what our seniors have told us, what is institutionalized in our culture and so on. So very much of what we're doing tend to be outcomes of our taking for granted truths and ideas. And normally we believe that we are very empirical, that we are very observant, that we rely on empirical phenomena to feed us then with ideas and knowledge. So the empirical world is the major source of our beliefs and understandings and so on. But it's always good to compare these two kind of truths or statements. One is that I believe it when I see it. And that's how we assume that we work. I believe it when I see it. My observations runs my beliefs and knowledge. Sometimes we function like that, but often it's good to contrast that with another type of idea, and that is I see it when I believe it. I see it when I believe it. So if we have a belief, it may be an ideological belief, a cultural taken for granted assumption, a theoretical conviction, or whatever, then it tends to be seen. So if I believe that leadership is very important, if I picked up that belief through reading a lot of leadership pornography or whatever, people told me that, or I'm an authoritarian person that I into hero worshipping, then I see a lot of examples how important leadership is. And it's easy to come up with good examples. So I'm right, yes. I know that leadership is important, and I can point at that and that and that and that. And then that's been kind of supported. But if I don't see, if I don't think that leadership is particularly important, I mean, people are perhaps they're grown up and reasonably competent, and so why do they need leadership? I mean, you're an adult, aren't you? You need to walk around and waiting for somebody that will hold your hand in working life. And then you believe that leadership is not particularly important, only in exceptional circumstances. And then you see probably a lot of examples of this. Or if you take gender, females are discriminated against. If you believe that, you see a lot of examples on this. If you are convinced that females are not being discriminated against, then you probably can marshal an enormous amount of evidence based on your experience and observations for so not being the case. We are very selective in what we remember in ambiguous situations. Reality very seldom then speaks clearly to us. We tend to project or make interpretations. So this is very important. And for all these reasons, we need to carefully try to cultivate our capacity to be reflexive about issues. This doesn't mean that we should not be good at technicalities and the normal procedures and be diligent when it comes to doing interviews, observations, and then typing interview transcripts or producing interview transcripts and then sorting the material and reading literature. So we need to do all that as well. But reflexivity is, for me, key behind good and interesting research, particularly interesting research that is not just delivering results that people can accept, but not necessarily feel that thrilled about. And then there are different versions of reflexivity, and this is partly covered in Reflexive Methodology book. And very briefly then, we can talk about reflexivity in the form of meism. Meism. How I in my operations, my readings, my interpretations, also my emotions, my background, my imagination, and so on. How all this is extremely important for the research that you tend to produce, what you accomplish. And a lot of people, when they're into reflexivity, they emphasize heavily then the researcher, me, the knower. And the knowledge development project can't be separated from the knower, the researcher, who is kind of active and doing a lot of things. And that is the key element of research. I think this is very important. Of course, we can't just reduce the I or me out of the equation. The researcher, particularly in qualitative research, is extremely significant. But it's easier then to be misled by the apparent significance and salience of the researcher, I. Because behind me, there is a we. And most people are not that extremely original or independent or self-going or whatever, but are very much formed by the academic tribe. So there is a we, the paradigm. I mean, one aspect around the paradigm is the research community, the society. And and we are very much formed by this. So when you look at academic products, articles, you can't, because there's always some element of the individual author and researcher putting his or her imprint on the study. But in most cases, they look more or less the same. The bloody articles, they look more or less the same. To quote one, they are even worse than others on it, but one previous editor of Academy of Management Journal. Are you familiar with Academy of Management Journal? Yes? Yes, you are. And this may be something that you dream about. Oh, if I could get published in Academy of Management Journal, then I would be a true scholar. I would be an original person, really stand out as a true individual. But this previous editor has said that the articles now increasingly, they look like black cats in a dark coal cellar. They look at black cats in a dark coal cellar. You can't separate any from each other. They all look the same. And this means that we need to consider the we, the collective, conformist, mainstreaming mechanisms and social sources that tend to drive us in our ways of doing research. So it's very much a collective project, and it becomes, I mean, it's good and bad, but I think in many ways it becomes worse. Now everybody should do committee work. So you more frequently see papers written by 3, 4, 5 people. Some decades ago, almost all work was done by 1 or 2 authors. And now we are moved from meism to weism. And we need to carefully consider how the academic tribe is doing the work, the academic community, the academic social cage, or whatever, they tend to produce our results. The third option is interactionism, how complex interactions with the field tend to drive studies, and not always necessarily in a good kind of way, where you have good collaboration, co-construction of knowledge, and so on. But sometimes it's like a conspiracy. As a leadership research, you're interested in leadership, and then as a manager, you're interested in appearing as a leader, doing leadership, and then you join forces, and then you agree that leadership is important, and people are doing leadership, and there are certain problems and issues and so on. But it's so easy that the interaction lead to peculiar effects. So all interactions between researchers and those that we are studying, or those financing us, or having expectations, stakeholders, or whatever, they tend in different ways tend to drive research in sometimes peculiar ways. I mean, just imagine when you're doing a study, what do people that you're studying think about? What's the purpose of all this? And sometimes they probably think that you are a spy, or you are like a PR agent. You are helping them branding then the profession or the organization or whatever. And a lot of, so I remember Martin Parker in his dissertation, he noticed that people in the interaction, they were seeing him in different ways. So some of his interviewees, they saw him as a student, young, inexperienced, need to have a lot of things explained for. Other people saw him as an expert, a management organization expert. And the third group, they saw him as a spy for top management. And of course, if you have like interactions then colored by these various understandings or beliefs of what you are, what you do, then of course this strongly then affects your work and what you are accomplishing. And here is a lot of sources then for thinking through about reflexivity. The fourth aspect here is criticism. That's very much how social institutions, interests, and ideologies, they work through or on the researcher. That we are in a particular society with perhaps classes and occupations and companies and industries and social institutions, HR people, branding experts, sales folks, etc., equal opportunity experts, and so on. So there's a lot of politics and a lot of ideologies involved in all this. And we're just interested in how is a hospital functioning. I mean, it's a hornet's nest in terms of different like interests and perspectives and so on. And if we're studying HR, human resource management systems and practices, is that neutral? Well, you probably are inclined then to support human resource management professionals and functions. And indirectly, perhaps you may support or strengthen then the inclination that there's a bloody lot of HRM that people may suffer from or benefit from. It can work in different ways, but sometimes there's an enormous amount of policies and so on. Just one example on this, I had a workshop one day with number of HR managers, and one of the HR managers have gone from being HR manager to become an operative manager. She described how enormous amount of systems and policies and management control that was developed. And then she told others, have you any idea how much we are supposed to comply with in this organization? Friends, we really need to change the way we are thinking. And if you're not careful, when you study HRM and you consider all aspects around all this, you may just reinforce that kind of perhaps rather problematic way of running organizations. And a lot of us, if we are kind of unreflexive of what we are doing, then we just feed into business management machines in rather problematic way. But then, of course, we need to do something else then. Well, I studied HR and I want to reinforce then HR practices to reinforce the function and so on. I mean, we need to be much more careful about the broader societal context and various interests that need to be considered. And the fifth aspect around reflexivity here is discursivism. And that is very much how we work with language. Genres, texts, styles, the picking of words, how we produce versions of reality through how we use discourse. And phenomena here, well, that's entrepreneurship. What does it mean? How are people using this word? How are various people selling stuff or trying to get by or whatever? They are constituted as entrepreneurs. Just following then the word here and then considering carefully how reality is being produced in a particular way through then how we use language, or what kind of genre that we are working with. I mean, are we into that kind of style or narrative or not? So there's a lot of things that one can reflect upon here in the relationship to that. So the point here that we should be curious and interested in phenomena out there, leadership, but I normally think of phenomena in terms of citation marks with a slightly ironic touch. So we are interested in leadership, not leadership. We're interested in innovations, resistance, women, perhaps, or women and men, HR, professions, institutions, institutional logics, and so on. We are less, I mean, we should be careful about how much we move into then making firm statements about that before we think through quite reflexively how are we involved in constituting the phenomena we're making statements about. And this makes things a bit more complicated, of course, but then you have a lot of options. So you see the world is much more open for your creative moves, open for being produced, constructed, divided up in very different ways from what is common. For example, we don't have to study leaders. We can study people that are, I try with different language often, study then hips, high influencing people, or high influencing positions, or high influencing processes. Then you try to open up, then something goes on in organization. There are some people that seems to be more influential than others part of the time. They are a leader. And the others are not, they are followers. Bang, bang. And then you try to study that. But you can also be a bit more sensitive and avoid then using these worn out labels. Frameworks and see what goes on. There's some situations where there are high impactful processes going on. Okay, then we study that. And we use an alternative expressions like high influencing people or processes or positionings. Or we see that there are references to women. And then we see this is not self-evident because the world is full of women and men. We instead then ask, interesting. Suddenly somebody is being kind of placed in the category, or the category is being used, women. You as a woman, or we as women, or whatever. And you see, this is not self-evident, but as a bit interesting and unexpected. Actually, one of my greatest contribution to mankind was when we observed, because we prefer observations rather than interviews. But one was senior manager, vice president of a business, well, a division, business area or division. He had about 100 junior managers. Then he said to them, "Why are you here?" "That's because you are managers in this division." And they can say, well, there are managers and so on. So that's kind of objective, neutral truth. No, you can see this is a phenomenon. Why was he telling them that? What was like the performative function here? What was being accomplished? And of course, then if you refer to people as managers in this division, then they are influenced in thinking about themselves in a bit. Yes, I'm a manager. I belong to this division. I need to be loyal. I belong to the we group here. So, and that led me or us to write a paper then called Producing the Appropriate Individual Identity Regulation as Organizational Control. And that's the second most cited paper in Journal Management Studies ever. And I'd say that's like a fantastic good paper, but you sometimes just are careful in putting categories into pre-established, putting your observations and your empirical material into particular conventional categories, but just see if you can interpret this in a slightly different way than is usual. So you try to open up and think, what does this mean? Can I understand this as interesting in a different way? Can I resist my inclination to just use a particular way of ordering the world and see it in different ways through considering a lot of different perspectives and aspects. And this is very much what reflexivity is about. So we try to liberate ourselves from this type of pre-structured, conventionalized, disciplined ways of thinking about issues, and then you open up. I'm not certain that my example there was the best one, but it's one that I like to talk about. So now I'm almost finished here, and then we have some minutes for questions and so on. Sorry for talking a bit too long. Reflexivity, it's very much the kind of research is very much reproduction of conventions and truth. Few people have something really interesting and innovative and novel to say, unfortunately. But we can change that. And reflexivity is not the panacea, it's not the recipe, but it's something that we can perhaps use as one possible framing or vehicle or input trigger to doing research a bit differently. And that is that it should encourage not being too much mainstream, conventionalized, but consider alternative angles on phenomena. Move out of our normal selves, our normal then research groups, the cages that were otherwise and what is that we need to create distance and then need to make also ourselves, our academic groups, our field work, societal imprints and language use objects of interpretation. What am I doing here? How am I producing reality in a particular way? Can I produce it in other ways? Are there other ways of opening up this project? And the idea is then we avoid a lot of these conventional mistakes where you plug phenomena into categories, into conventions prematurely. You are not open, you are not curious enough. We can do that, and we can also think differently, more imaginatively, creatively, in other ways, even though sometimes it's a bit scary because it's always the safest to think as everybody else is doing that. But it's so bloody boring. So now I'm kind of preached about reflexivity. So should we open up for comments, complaints, questions?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mats. Yes, the subject is not easy for understanding. Yeah, we have a couple of questions in the chat. I will try to aggregate those. Actually, I want to start with a pragmatic question. All right. So, do you have a kind of structure or a template which can be applied to management research in regards to reflexivity? So how can we reflect and be reflexive researchers, not for the sake of pure reflexivity? So around which dimensions we need to start our reflections? And are there differences across methodological streams? Or is it any kind of universal template that can fit all sizes? So can we answer this question at all, Mats?
Well, I mean, the problem is that you can do this in an endless number of different ways. And I think we normally should avoid recipes or formulas for doing this, apart from on a very general level then. So sometimes in order to structure it a bit more clearly and not be totally flooded by reflexivity. I mean, there are problems with this. One is that you kind of, it's too much. I can't handle this. It makes me very nervous, and it ends with me having decision anxiety. So therefore, I think it's good to organize this in different ways. And sometimes you have like a devil's advocate. You try to find some people in your network that are a bit different. Not extremely different, because then you just get confused, but sufficiently different. And then ask them, can you be a devil's advocate here? Can you question me or we or ideas of interaction or my favorite vocabulary perspective? I mean, that's one way of doing this. You can have groups where you look at text chunks more reflexively, not exactly what's your kind of sample and reasoning and literature and so on, but what are you doing here? So take 1 or 2 steps back from the immediate project, and then you get some overall perspective on this. So you can do this collectively. You can work with having a counter perspective. So here is like my dominant perspective. I'm a Foucauldian, or I'm a grounded kind of theory-inspired person studying healthcare or whatever. Okay, are there any interesting counter perspectives to this that can create a tension? So you always work with an alternative mindset here. Or you can work with metaphors. So this is my metaphor of this project. Are there counter metaphors? In organization studies, we have Morgan's metaphors that is very popular, like organization is a machine or culture or organism or brain or theater or madhouse or whatever. We can think about our own project in different ways. I actually have a book just sent to the publisher on reimagining the research process on metaphors for how we think about different elements. So you can do a lot of, and yeah, and also the next webinar will be a bit more specific and a particular take on all this, and then the same with mystery creation. So you can do this in a lot of different ways, but it's important then to have some structure and not kind of just being reflexive, but think through how can I work with this in not a square way, but still in a kind of structured way with a kind of framework and some clear reference points.
Great. And to make our understanding a little bit easier, if we start from the mathematical tool of taken from opposites. So can you name any kind of methodology that precludes reflexivity? Apologies. For example, I was a bit surprised when reading your book that grounded theory is more instrumental than reflective. All right, so for some reason I thought that grounded theory requires, and certainly it requires researchers' cognition, and I was taking that grounded theory cognition grounded theory is reflexivity as well. So can you name methodological streams that actually would say that reflexivity is redundant?
Well, I think that no methodology is really redundant. So even if you think about, I mean, if you use a questionnaire, you try to measure something, or you rely on statistics, then I think that any researcher needs worth his or her salt. They need to carefully think through. I mean, we know that if you use that scale or that scale, then results will differ. If you send a questionnaire then saying that this is like a management department or business school, or this is organization studies, people sending this, there will be probably some different responses because people will read the purpose differently. So even if you are a quantitative researcher, perhaps not a pure mathematician, but even if we work with statistics, available statistics and so on, I do think we need to be reflexive. But then, of course, there's scale. So some try to minimize the need for reflexivity. And here you have, in the qualitative research, I was said that grounded theory and other hardware kind of, or the hardware based ways of analyzing data tend to be more reflexivity minimizing. But if you go out there and do ethnographic work, so you're quite open and see what's happening here, what are the interesting aspects, and how is this kind of organization functioning, then you probably need to be much more reflexive. So then you have like a scale here of low level and very high level of reflexivity. And then also the purpose. If you like to, I like just to report empirical findings, then it's like low or medium level of reflexivity being called for. But if you want to say something that is a bit more innovative, a bit more novel, that is provocative and makes people think differently from they or we normally think, then it calls for much more reflexivity. So I can have like a scale here in terms of specific methods and then also ambitions. And then you have like low reflexivity versus very high level of reflexivity. Personally, I like the more kind of hyper reflexive stuff, which sometimes means that you have limited empirical material, but you can get a lot of ideas out of that if you think quite carefully about different options and possibilities, and are very much reflexive about where you're coming from and the normal stuff that you're supposed to just reproduce, which you should not necessarily do. So.
Excellent. Good news that reflexivity is never redundant, regardless of the methods that you are using for your management research. Great. Now I want to open questions to the audience. Please unmute yourself and ask your questions to Mats. Please bear in mind that we have about 200 people on the call, and many people would wish to ask their questions. So one question per delegate. And please be specific and succinct in your questions. So if you are ready, please unmute yourself and pose your question. Anyone brave?
Yeah, oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Hello?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Matt and Sergey. Regarding the reflexivity, do you think that reflexivity is more related to qualitative methods, as these methods cannot be generalized? So in opposite of this, we can transfer this methodology or transferability, but this transferability should be based on the reflexive or reflective notes by the researcher. What do you think about this? Thank you.
Well, I do think, as I said before, that all research worth its salt need to be reflexive, and but to various degrees. I do think that note-taking all the time, try to think, for what am I doing here? What ideas can I come up with? Can I think differently about this? Am I stuck here, or am I too confused? I mean, reflexivity means that you should open up. Here are new options. All the time be prepared to open up, but you need to close as well. So you can't have all options available all the time. So when I'm sure that this is a good idea, it works, and then can I open it up? Yes, now it's an even better idea perhaps, or there are two good ideas that I work with, and then you try to close it. But taking notes and all the time use all situations in order to get inspiration. I mean, you can also look around what's happening around you. Can I get some ideas here when I read media or think about issues, talk with my friends and blah, blah, blah. There's an enormous amount of options all the time then to get input to what we are doing. We don't have to go out there and interview 35 people and then assume what they said to us during 1 hour interviews. That's necessarily the best way to capture a particular phenomena.
Great, thank you very much. Rob, you were the next. Rob Lubernik, please.
Yeah, thank you for this inspiring and very interesting talk. I was triggered by your comments about using metaphors and maybe also analogies. So I've worked with some researchers that may be considered as high esteemed researchers in the field, whatever that may mean. But what I noticed when going through data analysis is the number of analogies recognizing in the data or using then analogies and seeing that in the data. I mean, as you were mentioning, it's a kind of mutual process, I guess. And I was wondering indeed how that then steers what you will find in the end. So is this a quality? Is this a skill? Is it maybe something that creates a bias in data collection? And also I was wondering to what extent is it then actually different from using a theoretical framework or perspective versus using analogies or metaphors? So yeah, if you could explain a bit more about to what extent this is desirable or if there's something to be done with caution.
Yeah, no, I think that, I mean, it's both. We need to consider options and use whatever creative resources we have. Metaphorization of phenomena, they are definitely something that can lead to ideas and insights and so on. They tend to be a bit more, I think, open and a bit more playful than using theories and theoretical perspectives. So you can metaphorize and then you see where it leads to, and of course that should need followed up with some more kind of systematic line of thinking type of approach then, which is more theoretical perhaps. I mean, we always have biases. Whatever we are doing, then there's always, we see something and then we don't see other things, well, other aspects. So I think that we need to just be careful that we are not seduced or that we lock us into this. Much idea with reflexivity is then to work with not denial of bias, but acknowledging, well, bias or selectivity or the perspective-laden nature of everything. But if we can kind of balance that or confront and be much more aware of all this, then we can handle it in a much better way. I think we need to be aware of the problems, but we can work through them. And at the end of the day, it should lead to some interesting results. And then sometimes if data is fully explained by a particular metaphor or theory, I mean, that will never be the case anyway. But I do think we should be less worried about getting all the details correct all the time. than having a credible and interesting case for something. And that calls for a bit different approach than all this kind of data management and presumed precision in all the work with data, which I think we never really accomplish, because all the data we are working with, it tends to be rather ambiguous and a bit arbitrary anyway.
Great, thank you very much, Mats. Irina.
Hello, thank you, Dr. Alvesson, for the presentation and sharing this different perspective of how to approach research. My question is, are there any weaknesses or dangers in practicing a particular level of reflexivity or type of reflexivity when you are approaching a research project?
Research is, you can see research in different ways. One is, of course, that here is the safe route. If you do like this, then you can't go wrong. And this is what grounded theory, for example, they tend to promise. I see research as a minefield. Whatever you're doing, you will probably then tread on some mines, and hopefully they're relatively small. You can take care of them, and it's not like devastating in terms of effects. So there will always be like problems and imperfections. So if you just take reflexivity, I mean, one trap is that you are very bad on reflexivity. So you just go out there. When I was studying innovation or entrepreneurships, and half of everybody's they are entrepreneurs, and then you have a lot of assumptions and claims, and then you produce your data based on that kind of sometimes peculiar assumption. So you can get wrong in the village from the very start, and so on. So that's one type of problem. Too low level of reflexivity, but you can also be hyper reflexive, and then you get confused, and it's kind of too much, and you don't have time and energy to do the more basic stuff either. So, or you can get in love with a particular theory or theoretician, and you may have a fixed idea. This is a fantastic, good and interesting idea. And then you are not open for shortcomings, either in relationship to empirical material or the kind of possible low level, intellectual level of the particular idea. So there's an enormous amount of things that can go wrong in research, and we just have to do the best we can, be as reflexive as possible, at the end of the day, produce something that is reasonably okay in terms of empirical accuracy and credibility, but then also having something to say. So it's not just a very kind of flat empirical study or just one other reproduction of a truth that people have heard so many times before.
Thank you.
Great, thank you, Mats. So those who want to ask questions, can you please raise your hands, and I will try to organize a line here. And now we have several people who raised their hands, and I'm trying to facilitate this. Ignas, you are the next.
Yes, thanks. So thanks a lot, first of all, for this very interesting and thought-provoking presentation and discussion. What my question concerns is the kind of the possibilities to push the idea of reflexivity beyond methodologies of empirical analysis. So from your argument, Mats, you based the importance of reflexivity, the way I see it, on the performativity of social sciences and the effect it has on society and also on us as researchers, of course. And then, of course, it puts researchers in a position where we have a rather big responsibility towards society, not to produce theories that might shape society in negative ways. And so my question is then, shouldn't reflexivity also be expanded to the ethical stances that we have towards general social questions and so on and so forth, if we already take this performativity arguing route?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question, and the role of the research. I mean, why are taxpayers or students or funding bodies or whoever then paying us for doing this? I mean, it can't just be that we add to our CVs and our employer and promotabilities. We should, particularly now with mass research in mass higher education society, it's an army of people doing all this, and we need carefully to consider what am I contributing with. I mean, if you are a lecturer, the research part of your lectureship may be the same as one may mean one nurse or police officer less. And somehow I think we need to think what can I motivate this, and that should be through doing research that has something to say and make a contribution. And here you need to think the broader context, not just here is one piece of information that a particular function or occupation or company wants to have because it may serve their interest in more resources or higher status or something. We need to think a bit more broadly and reflexively about what are we contributing with, what is our role or identity as researchers. So I think that's a good question, and also something that reflexivity should connect to.
Thank you, Mats. Beverly.
Thank you. I'm just so delighted to hear your perspective and to know that we have been functioning with limitations in research. What would be your suggestion to me? I'm pretty visual, and I work for universities that really have rubrics, and they tell our researchers to fit into a particular box with components for what they must do. If I recommend reflective methodology, how would I go about doing that, ensuring that my researchers are able to apply your methodology?
Yeah, no, it is tricky. It's of course, I mean, the research that we do, even if we are strong and courageous and risk-taking individuals, and most of us are not.
Yeah.
We tend to be quite conformist and cautious and want to have the right output and so on. But even if we are, then it is very tricky. So we tend to be dependent on social environment that is supporting. And one good advice is always then, if you do something that is, even if it's very conventional, you need a lot of support. If it's a bit more unconventional and risk-taking, then I think organize this in different ways. Go to some conferences, try really then to find some like-minded people. I mean, you can read stuff and then try to connect and then get support, and you can take turns in being devil's advocates, combining that and being very kind of supportive and therapeutical in the approach. So I think that the social organization around all this is quite important for many people. And then I mean, I spent half my academic life then producing an enormous amount of resources here, books and articles. So there's a lot of stuff available, and of course a lot of others brighter people than I have written in this area as well. I think that I and my co-authors' advantage is very much that we are close then to empirical studies in organization and management and so on. So it's a bit different if you're a philosopher, which you may be extremely smart, but it tends to be a bit more detached, distanced from the work of a social science researcher. So we do a lot of empirical stuff and then try to make connections to broader issues as well. But the social organization of all this is quite important to consider.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mats. Adina.
Thank you, Matt, for the emphasis on this self-reflection that you so well summarized for us. On the other side, just listening to your presentation, my first thought was, to what extent there is a sort of bounded rationality in our ability to move into this extreme self-reflection. So to a certain extent, I felt that we should also have a sort of self-confidence during the research, and that there is a degree of taken for grantedness that is healthy, I would say, in our approach to the reality out there. And one of the early things you mentioned in your presentation, very early, you passed over it very lightly, related to the fact you said we should think of our interpretations as constructed, not discovered. And I feel this has a much deeper epistemological meaning to you, and I would be very curious to know what you meant by that. As an observation, and I'm not a diehard grounded theorist, but I do feel that the discovery and the pragmatist turn in grounded theory over the last 10 years was fruitful, precisely in helping the reflexivity be based in routines, research routines of the sort that people are asking about here, and that your contribution to the field is, in fact, of speaking of new routines in additions, like metaphors, for instance, we could use, in addition to all the long tradition in grounded theory of opening up the data to memoing and so on. But the constructed versus discovered issue would be, I'm just curious about it, what you meant by that.
Yeah, no, I mean, often it can be, I think, practical to think in terms of both. So there's always something that we haven't thought about, and we think that the empirical phenomena then they kind of invite us to seeing. So there's an element of discovery there. People say something that is surprising, or they behave in an odd way, or whatever. But then also it's never so that reality just speaks for itself. It's very much a matter of finding the right framing, the right way of constructing, interpreting, giving meaning, paying attention to a lot of things. So in that sense, it's always an element of construction as well. So there are very few acts that, I mean, somebody's raising the voice. Is that because people look tired, the person is, and therefore need to be waken up, the person is kind of irritated, want to demonstrate management or leadership or whatever. So, and also my case here with the manager, the executive, then vice president telling other people, why are you here? Because you are managers in this division. That can be seen as totally trivial, totally uninteresting. But if I construct that as like identity interpellation, as an act of power through producing subjects in a particular way, then I construct the phenomena. So it's not just that I like discover something here. It's very much my background, my meanings, my interpretations. So in that sense, it's always a combination of different elements, but seldom it's so that like when we discover something that is there. So normally we need to do something that is a bit more active, guided by frameworks, guided by these interpretations, our imagination, a lot of other things. And grounded theory, they give some space for this, but relatively little, because they tend to emphasize here work with data, being very diligent, being very systematic, use codification. They tend to emphasize things in a slightly different ways. And here that's less reflexive than my kind of more bold approach perhaps would suggest.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm an early stage scholar, and I totally concur with whatever you mentioned about most research being stupid. So there's no better way of saying this, but I come from a practice background. Like, I've been a practitioner myself, and some research doesn't really make sense to me. But still, I would want to understand from you whether reflexivity is like, it's a kind of ontology, that how we think, how we see the world, or is it a method of doing research? And also, I would like to know what are the differences from, let's say, narrative inquiry or discourse analysis. Are these methods ways of exploiting reflexivity, or are they just methods that could also be non-reflexive?
Yeah, no, I think that that's a good point. I do think that these methods, they can be used. I mean, everything can be used in the reflexive or non-reflexive ways. So sometimes, if you are very much just into discourse analysis, very specifically, and of course you can do that in a very smart and skillful way, and that may be your only interest. But sometimes it may be a point in zooming out. And not just be interested in the nitty-gritties of discourse all the time, or think about different discourse concepts and what are the advantages and disadvantages with this. And often discourse is used very kind of loosely and broadly and sloppily and so on. And the idea with reflexivity is you consider the drawbacks, the limitations of every approach. And sometimes I have the feeling that people are into discourse. Discourse constitutes reality. Bam. And then you proceed from there. Well, if you take one reflexive step back, well, discourse may not constitute reality all the time. Perhaps money makes the world go round, discourse makes the world go round. There may be different media and different ways of understanding this. And then if you work with the all-embracing concept of discourse, that kind of constitutes everything. Well, there may be limitations with that the reflexive person would be aware of. The same with narrative, etc. For me, reflexivity is partly an ontological issue. Is this how you operate in the world, that you like to see things in different ways and then have like a reflexive way of being, which the modern person to some extent always have. I mean, we have a lot of impulses, and the world is not like set in stone like in an old village 1,000 years ago, which was a closed system. So we tend always to be a bit reflexive, but then so much that makes us also anti-reflexive. These are my truths, my ideology, my convictions, my kind of mindset, my identity, my favorite guru, and so on. So reflexivity is very much a matter of working with that. And of course, you can use then reflexivity very specifically as methods. So the next time I will talk about specific methodologies, then for how to work then to generate ideas and alternative interpretations following from this methodology. Today, I mainly talked about this as a general ideal, a way of approaching research. So that's a bit more on an overall and general level. And I guess that some of you are a bit frustrated because this is so general and broad, but this is like the basics, and there are no shortcuts for reflexivity. We need to think through issues and can't just say, well, here are the 10 points, and then if you follow them, wow. No, it doesn't function so well like that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellent. I don't see any more raised hands in the chat.
So Sophie has waved her hand, I think.
Sophia?
I just did it. Thank you. Thank you, Matt. This is a really helpful discussion. And I think a little bit based on what you were just saying, I wonder if you can say a little bit more about when to know when to stop, and when to know when to submit, and then when to what degree do you also continue to engage in reflexivity throughout the publication process? And what has been your experience with that? Do you find that reviewers work with you so that you're pushed to do more? Do you find that you're even asked to backtrack a little bit? How does that play out for you?
Yeah, and I think that are good points. And a pragmatic answer is that you can reflexivity. You don't have time and energy, and then you stop. So pragmatic reason, or you see that now this works. I can show to myself and others there is an outcome of a reflexive process. So I thought about this first, but now I kind of consider options, and now I think that they have a better interpretation, a better idea. There's a clear payoff. So, and that's always that idea with reflexivity. It's not just that we kind of circle around and then tick this off. Is on one page in a journal article to demonstrate that we have done that as well. I mean, we vacuum clean the literature, we show data management, we tick off reflexivity. That's no point necessarily. There should be a clear added value for the reader, and before that for the researcher. That reflexivity made me think differently and more perhaps clever or interesting or innovative way. I do think that a good paper, it can show reflexivity without necessarily spelling this out for the reader. I mean, you can start by, normally we think about leadership in terms of leaders and followers. Well, perhaps we should think about this in different ways. And then you show then in your reasoning reflexivity rather than you have like a separate section where you demonstrate reflexivity in addition to or above what you have done or doing things. And I think that is the ideal, really, that the reader should recognize this is a reflexive research. This is a piece where there are clear imprints, not of the mechanics of all the work, but also person thought through about these issues.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. We have a couple of more raised hands in the chat. Hong Bui, can you please unmute yourself and ask your question?
Thank you very much, Sergey. Hi, Matt, Hong from Bath. My questions here is that, I am a quantitative person and moving to qualitative. And my question, quite practical one, is that when you have a rich data and good story, but because you're not qualitative researchers, and now how can we develop from rich data, good story, into a good papers?
Yeah, no, it's so you think about quantitative research in particular now, or?
Yes, because I've been reading on phenomenologies. I'm working on that kind of methodologies, and now I'm listening to reflexivities, and I'm trying to think about whether I can combine those two methods in order to make a good stories out of my data. The data is quite rich, but somehow I'm still, struggling in my mind that how can I turn that stories into a good paper? I guess that it related to your last session on theory building, but if you can give me some quick advice on, in my position, and then how I can develop it into good paper.
Well, it's a tricky question, but then if you look at theory development, you can do this in two ways. One is then very much through data as building blocks in the theory building process. And this is one metaphor, we build theory.
Yeah.
Another approach is that we don't build theory, but we get like the idea, the spark, the trigger.
Yeah.
And then you see this is the source of inspiration. And then if you have a lot of rich data, then you just surf through that and see what ideas do I get out of all this. And then you may not be able to have a clear empirical case for this, but if the theoretical idea is good enough, then that's fine. Then you don't have to. I mean, why do we do empirical studies? Well, you can do it either because you like to have findings or proofs or whatever. Or you can do this in order to get inspiration for your theoretical thinking. And in my case, then with this example, why are you here? Because you are managers in this division. I mean, it's only one line, and I can't claim any particular empirical findings or results based on that, but it started to make me think, okay, how is control being exercised? And then it's very much identity regulation. So I said to you, you as young academics, or you as scholars, or you, in most cases, I guess, PhD students, or whatever, then people, or you as females, if I would just turn to women here, then of course, all these ways of calling upon people, they do something. And then you can start to develop a theory based, I could do that at least. So sometimes you can see rich empirical material more as sources of inspiration, idea triggers, than something that you work much more systematically in there. I mean, one metaphor for good empirical research that we have in our forthcoming book on reimagining the research process is research as crap reduction. Crap reduction. So when you do a study, then you get enormous amount of crap. I mean, confused interview statements, boring observation protocols, and confused responses to questionnaires and so on. Most of it is crap. It has no value, no meaning whatever. Away with that, and then see, this is something that I can learn from. And there's a very general response to your question here, Hong, is then that one could see empirical material.
So when's the book?
Sorry. As sources of theoretical.
I'm sorry again. Yeah, thank you very much. And my question is, when is your book out, the metaphor one?
In June or July.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mark.
Excellent. Thank you. I think now it's Ibrat's question and then Safi, and I suppose we have time only for 2 questions. So Ibrat, then Safi.
Thank you, Sergey. Mats, I was just wondering if reflexive practice entails uncovering assumptions or what is taken for granted in the way we see the world or interpret things. How far or how deep could or should we go in uncovering those assumptions?
Sufficiently far so that you think that now I've understood something a bit differently, that is credible or interesting or helpful, but not so far so that people can't understand it or find that it appears kind of weird. So in most cases, it's more a matter of having something that is novel and credible. And sometimes it doesn't mean that you have to go that far, but just one example. I and Susanne, we had one piece where we asked to write about the connecting manager. And then you normally think about the middle manager, and then you have like the middle, top, below, middle. But then you start to think, assumption is that middle, that's a good way of conceptualizing that. But middle, that's like a fixed position. You are in the middle, like in the sandwich. But then you start to think, perhaps in terms of process, what appears to be a static phenomena is in fact a processual phenomena. So then we thought about the middle manager, up and down. So sometimes you are senior person to junior, and sometimes, or more often, you are junior to senior people. And they try to navigate here without getting your strings messed around and so on. So just an example of you have an assumption of stability, and then you look at processuality to some extent, and then you have something that is slightly novel to say about worn out topic like middle managers. So move a bit away from assumptions that have this kind of very caging in or imprisoning effect on your thinking, which most assumptions tend to have.
Great answer. Enough to surprise, not enough to irritate. Excellent. Safi, And it's the final question on our call, so please ask very good question.
Oh, wow, pressure's on. Thank you. And thank you so much. I know everybody keeps saying it and writing it. It's been a very, very inspiring talk, so thank you for that. I think the most part that really sort of I had an aha moment with was when you said most people say, when I see it, I'll believe it. But in reality, we need to believe it first. Or it can seem that in reality, people need to believe in order to see. And then you used an example of gender equality. And that's why it really hit home with me, because I do research on gender work and on entrepreneurship. And I teach a course on gender and entrepreneurship. And it's quite interesting. I think the students that come in that already are believers, and then the students that come in that are ready to already shoot down every piece of information I give, every statistic, every fact, figure, etc. So, and then there's always those in between that hopefully I win over with my charm, I'm not sure. But anyway, I guess what I'm trying to say is, how can we get the non-believers to believe and then see the findings of our research, which of course we need to be reflexive about because we're already a little bit biased before we've even started. But how can we win people over through our writing? And possibly if you can also add a little bit in our teaching as well.
Yeah, no, I think that I mean, there is issues here. One, of course, is that we need to have a credible case where we are quite thoughtful in terms of what we are doing. So if we are a strong believer, then we will, we will preach for those converted already. So they will accept everything, yeah, and so on. And others, they may be quite skeptical, irrespective of all the moves and so on. So I do think that we need to consider how people are functioning. These are the assumptions and these are the ideas. And if one is open about one's own then ways of dealing with this and can be a bit more reflexive in all writing, that you don't kind of insist on a particular finding or truth or using a particular guru or whatever, but you offer this is one way of thinking about issues. Or these are empirical material and statistics and whatever, and they're always a bit arbitrary. And can be debated. So writing in such a way so that you come out as a reflexive person in the eyes of the other, and then also think about what may be the assumptions and ideas and expectations of people that we are approaching. And of course, if they're extremely diverse from us, then it will never be in a dialogue. It's no point, but we can try to say something to people that are quite reasonably different from us. And the problem with a lot of research, it tends to be very much then within the cage, within the social box that we are into. So if one is into gender aspects or feminist aspects on entrepreneurship, then most people are not so extremely interested. Those that are interested, they tend to have certain convictions and certain orientations, or they may respond very negatively to this. If I can open it up in different ways and perhaps then make the key points a bit later also in studies and so on, so you show something rather than here is the idea and there is as the input. It's very much based on whatever Butler or feminist research or whatever, but you show more kind of openness and curiosity, and then I can write in such a way or talk in such a way so that people may be kind of getting more interested in the subject and more open-minded. And this is, of course, also those that belongs to one's own side to make them or us think a bit differently about issues, which sometimes is a bit painful, because if you're into leadership, well, leadership is so bloody important. I would say it's not. Sometimes it's important. We need to really consider when it's important, and we need to consider also when we make it very important. Because as Foucault was saying, that there's a tendency that we produce the truth. And if one is aware of this, when we construct the female entrepreneur, or we construct entrepreneurship, or whatever, that these are not like natural objects out there. It's something that we do in, hopefully in a helpful way, so we can think more cleverly about issues. If we can bring that kind of reflexive orientation with us, then I do think that it's more likely that people may be on board. And so I at least have managed, I mean, my specialty is functional stupidity. So I always tell people that you are so bloody stupid. But it tends to work reasonably well because I'm also stupid, and that's part of human existence, that we tend to think very much like this. Mm. And then you have this example with I see it when I believe it. And it's not the entire way we function, but it's a major part of how a lot of us, a lot of the time, tend to function. And if we can bring that up as a key element for reflexivity, I think that can make certain communications and interactions a bit easier.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Mats. You know, it's a great pleasure and privilege to have intellectual discussions with you.